She layered her walls with turf, stone, and sheep pile, called cave witch until -50, took Bismarck. On the 18th of November, 1886, when the first hard freeze was just beginning to test the prairie grasses and the Missouri River had not yet locked solid, Halldóra Þórarinsdóttir Pálsson stood in the autumn sunlight with her torflear, a turf-cutting scythe with its long curved blade, and looked at the ridge she had built. The walls of her torfbær, her turf house, rose nearly 4 feet above the earth. 3 years of labor had gone into these walls. 3 years since her husband John had not returned from a late spring blizzard on the Hart River. His oxen and wagon consumed by the prairie as if the land itself had swallowed them whole. 3 years of her hands working the heavy scythe through sod, cutting the herringbone bias blocks that would become the outer course of her walls. The autumn wind came down from the north now, carrying the promise of the cold months. Halldóra had learned the rhythm of the prairie seasons from her neighbors. The Icelandic families who had settled in this bend of the Missouri understood cold in the way that only people from the far north could understand it. Cold was not merely the absence of heat. Cold was a force, a living thing, something that sought entry wherever it could find a weakness. She had seen what the wrong kind of house could become in deep winter. She had seen, in stories told by other settlers, what happened when a dwelling could not hold its heat. There had been families, 3 winters back, who had built in the manner of American settlers, with nothing but balloon frame wood and newspaper insulation. 2 of them had not made it to spring. Halldóra was 36 years old. She had been born at Síðumúli farm in Hvítársíða parish, Borgarfjörður, in the county of Mýrasýsla in western Iceland. Her father was Þórarinn Magnússon, a torfsmiður, a turf mason, who had built walls much like these for the farmers of Iceland. Her mother was Sigríður Bjarnadóttir, a thefari, a woman who felted wool and made cloth that never let wind pass through. Halldóra had learned from her father how to read the earth, how to cut the turf so that the roots held, how to bind each block tight against the next. From her mother she had learned the feel of sheep fleece, the weight of wet felting, the smell of lanolin that never quite washed away. Her father Þórarinn had been a respected man at Síðumúli. He could look at a patch of prairie sod and know which thickness to cut, which angle would give the strongest lock. He taught his daughter by having her cut the same blocks over and over until her arm knew the motion. He taught her the mathematics of angles and weight distribution. He taught her that the sod blocks, when laid in herringbone pattern, created a structure where no single block bore the weight alone. Each block supported its neighbors, and the neighbors supported it in return. This was the strength of the design. This was why such walls stood for centuries. She had been 24 years old when the Askja volcano awakened on the 29th of March in the year 1875. She remembered the morning when ash fell like snow at midday, when the sun became a copper disk behind the haze. She remembered her father, Þórarinn, walking out into the falling ash and coming back covered in a gray powder that was finer than flour. 2 days later, 4 inches of volcanic ash lay on the ground. The ash had buried the best grazing meadows, and many farms had been abandoned. Halldóra had watched her father's face as he looked at the fields where his sheep would no longer find grass. By autumn, the decision had been made: emigrate to America. 7 years later, in the spring of 1882, Halldóra had emigrated. She sailed from Reykjavík with her husband, Jan Pálsson, a carpenter and a good man, and their 3 young daughters. Sigríður was 3 years old. Helga was unborn. Auður was not yet thought of. They had come to the Dakota Territory with a chest of tools, a small sum of American dollars, and the knowledge that many Icelandic families were settling in a new community upstream from Bismarck, on a great river bend called the Painted Woods Bend. The voyage was rough. Halldóra had spent weeks below decks, holding Sigríður. But on the 23rd of April in 1885, John had taken the oxen to haul logs down from the North Bluffs. A late-season blizzard had come in the afternoon, white and sudden, and John had not come home. The oxen had not come home. The wagon had not come home. Halldóra had stood in the doorway of their half-finished sod house and had not wept because there was no time for weeping. Sigríður was 12 years old now. Helga was 9. Auður was 5. They were her charge. But the blizzard had cleared, and no one had seen him. A search party found the wagon overturned and the oxen, but not John. The prairie had taken him. The land was indifferent to the wishes of the people who lived upon it. She had hired men to help her build the torfbær properly. She had learned the new techniques from her father's own papers, letters he had sent from Iceland describing the walls the best farmers were building there to withstand the long winters. But the Dakota winters were different from Iceland winters. Here, on this slough-flat oxbow of the Missouri, the wind came down from the Arctic with nothing to stop it. The temperature could fall past the point where a man could breathe without pain. She had chosen to build. She could take the knowledge that her father had given her and apply it to this harsh new place. The house was built in 3 distinct layers, each with its own purpose, each with its own contribution to the whole. This was not something she had invented. This was something her father had taught her, something that the best builders in Iceland had developed over centuries. But in Iceland, the walls had been built to withstand wind and rain, and the cold that came with damp. Here on the prairie, the cold was different, drier, sharper, more penetrating. The wind came down from the Arctic with no mountains to stop it, no forest to slow it. She had to think through the problem again, using her father's knowledge as a foundation, but adapting it to this new place. She had to modify what he had taught her, improve upon it, create something new from the old knowledge. The outer course was the Klumbrunhaus, herringbone bias cut, sod blocks laid in alternating diagonal courses, each block locked against its neighbors like the bones in a hand folded into a fist. The blocks were 18 inches thick, and they did not rot because the prairie sod had roots so densely woven that they held the soil together for years. When she cut a block from the ground with her torfliar scythe, she could feel the roots resisting. The roots held the soil together with a grip that no mechanical force could easily overcome. Everything that lived here had learned to hold tight. Behind the Klumbrunhaus came the Rúmfeldur of Geru, the cavity packed with felted sheepskins from Magnus Sveinsson's Cheviot flock. These were felted sheepskins with pelt still attached, not loose fiber mixed into clay. The sheepskins had been treated with lanolin, an ancient grease that no cold could fully harden. The pelts had been felted by Halldóra's own hands and by the hands of her mother before her. The felting process took weeks, soaking fleece in hot water mixed with ash lye, then pounding and working it until the fibers twisted together. 3.5 inches of trapped still air meant no breeze could find its way through. This was where the real insulation came from, where the house would hold its heat against the severest cold. The inner face was the grioth-ladi, split fieldstone dry-laid and mortared with clay and a little straw. The stone held the heat close like cupped hands holding a bird. Even if the fire burned low, the stone would keep its heat and release it slowly through the night. Beyond the north and west walls, Halldóra had built an earth berm, a wall of compacted prairie sod and soil 4 feet thick. This berm would block the worst wind, the wind from the north. She had finished the last section on the 8th of January, just a week before the cold wave came. In November, Halldóra looked at what she had built, and she was satisfied. The single south-facing window was double-glazed with bottle glass, set in a clay frame with care. The roof was birch pole rafters under sod, 16 inches of turf on a mat of willow branches. It had taken her 3 years. Sigríður had helped her, carrying stones and holding the scythe while Halldóra made the cut. Helga had sorted the small stones for the clay mortar. By the 3rd summer, Auður had carried water. During winters, when the ground was frozen too hard to dig, she had worked on the inside, finishing the stone face and preparing the interior space for warmth. On that November afternoon, a black landau came down the river road from Bismarck, pulled by 2 matched horses, their coats dark as wet stone. The man who sat in the landau wore a wine-colored brocade waistcoat with a gold elk-tooth fob dangling on a watch chain. His name was Mortimer Pinckney Beecham. Beecham had come to Bismarck in 1873 with the Northern Pacific Railroad. He had established the Mercantile Bank and accumulated land claims. Recently, he had begun to acquire upstream land to develop as the Beecham Western Addition, a subdivision of town lots. Such a man could see Halldóra's land as an obstruction, an unimproved claim, an impediment to progress. He stepped down from the landau and stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the walls of her house. Halldóra did not stop her work. She went on cutting sod, her arm moving in the precise rhythm that 3 years had taught her. "Woman," he said, "this is not developed land." She straightened and turned to face him. "I have developed it," she said. "I have cut and laid 2,000 blocks of sod. I have quarried and split 200 tons of stone. I have built walls that will stand for 100 years. This is developed land. This is land that will outlast your town." Beecham looked at the house. He could see only a hole in the ground, nearly sunken, with grass-covered walls and a low entrance. The visible portion of the dwelling seemed almost primitive to his eye. He could not see the stone face inside, the layered sheepskins, the carefully designed berm. He saw only a hole. He turned back to his landau without another word. He sat in the black carriage, and his driver turned the horses, and they went back down the river road toward Bismarck. But as he rode, he was calculating how to acquire the land. On the 7th of January, in the year 1887, the Bismarck Boomer printed an editorial by Hezekiah Bunce titled, "A Cave for the Cave Witch." It called her dwelling, "a witch's burrow, no fit habitation for a Christian woman." It called her walls, "the delusions of a foreign woman, an Icelandic superstition masquerading as architecture." Halldóra read this aloud to her daughters by the hearth fire. Sigríður was 14. Helga was 11. Auður was 7. Her voice did not waver as she read the words that called her a witch. "These are the words of a small man," she said when she had finished. "A man who builds nothing, who fears what he does not understand. Your father said to me once, when the ash was falling on Iceland, that fear makes men cruel. This is fear. This man fears a woman who can do something he cannot do. Halldóra filed a formal claim with the county recorder, bringing diagrams of her walls drawn in her own hand. Pastor Pétur Hjalmarsson rode with her and confronted Beecham at the bank, telling him that the walls were sound construction. Magnus Sveinsson testified that he had supplied the materials and observed the work over 3 years. Torfbær comes out, an elder of the Mandan people, rode up to examine the house. The woman knows the wind, he said. The walls will stand. They will hold against the breath that kills men. On the 9th of January, the cold began. At sunset, the thermometer read 8 degrees below zero. Snow squalls came from the north, thin snow that cut the skin like broken glass. The snow came sideways, driven by a wind that seemed to have learned malice somewhere far north. Halldóra herded the 3 daughters inside and sealed the door carefully with cloth strips packed into the gaps. She stuffed the spaces where the door met the frame with old fleece scraps, pushing them in as tightly as she could. The window remained sealed except for 2 inches at the top for ventilation, to prevent the buildup of moisture that could frost the interior walls. By dawn on the 10th of January, the temperature had fallen to 22 below. The wind spoke to the sod walls, and the walls stood firm. It spoke to the berm, and the berm stood firm. Inside, Halldóra kept the hearth burning. The fieldstone hearth, 9 inches in diameter, burned a cord of wood every 5 days. She had prepared 5 cords of wood before the cold came, cut and stacked inside the house. As the fire burned, the stone absorbed the heat, and the heat spread through the stone into the room. The interior temperature held at 48 degrees. The stone itself, when she touched it at evening, was warm. This warmth would continue through the night, radiating out into the dwelling even as the fire burned low. On the 11th of January, the thermometer showed 34 below at dawn. The wind had stopped its voice now and had become a thing with a weight and substance, a constant pressure that pressed against the house as if trying to find a way through. The pressure never ceased. It came from the north, steady and relentless. Sigríður, who was 14 now and old enough to understand what such cold meant, read aloud from an old tribune. Her young sisters listened, huddled under sheepskins near the hearth. Audur's small fingers were busy with a piece of wool, trying to practice the felting technique that her mother had taught her. Outside, the snow had become so deep that the world beyond the window was no longer visible. On the 12th of January, the sun rose on a temperature of 41 below zero. The wind was still. The air itself seemed to have frozen solid, become something almost crystalline in its hardness. In Bismarck, 4 miles downstream, 2 of Beecham's new Western Addition display houses cracked. The stud walls split down their length as if a giant hand had seized them and wrung them like cloth. One of Beecham's clerks had written to him in panic, describing the sound. A sharp crack that echoed through the town at midnight. The wood of the frame, stressed by the cold, had simply given way. Inside Halldóra's torfbær, the interior temperature still held at 48 degrees. The Grjóthladi stone face maintained an interior surface temperature of 41 degrees. The difference was slight, but it was sufficient. Heat still moved, slowly, from the interior hearth through the stone. The felted sheepskin layer prevented the cold from traveling further. On the 13th of January, The thermometer showed 50 below at Painted Woods Bend. This was the extreme point, the moment when the cold had assembled all its force. Frost formed on the interior walls of the house. Halldóra scraped it away with a knife, and it fell to the floor in glittering shards. She sang to the daughters, old Icelandic songs that her mother had taught her, songs about the long winter nights and the sun's eventual return. "Cold takes a man fast on this prairie," she sang, translating her mother's words so the young ones could hear them. "Cold takes a man fast, but it cannot take a house that is built right. My father said so. His father said so. And now I say so." Outside, the world had become a place of white silence. On the morning of the 14th of January, as the darkness before dawn was beginning to gray at the edges, a woman came through the snow in a buffalo robe sled pulled by a single horse. She was wrapped in so many furs that only her eyes were visible. This was Margaret McTavish, a Scots Métis midwife from Fort Yates, 90 miles away. She was 58 years old. She had ridden through the cold for 2 days and 2 nights, stopping only to rest her horse and drink hot tea that she carried in sealed containers. She had come because Tom Bear Comes Out's nephew had ridden to Fort Yates with a message, and Margaret had understood immediately what was needed. "A woman needs company in such cold," Margaret said, when she had been brought inside and unwrapped from the furs. Her face was raw from the wind, her nose and cheeks bright red. "A woman needs company, and she needs nourishment. Eat this." She handed Halldóra a kettle of hot pemmican stew. Pemmican was meat that had been pounded with fat and berries, made to last through long winters. It was what the Métis traders used on their long journeys. Halldóra served it to her daughters, and they ate and felt strength return to their small frames. Margaret's presence in the house was also a kind of strength. She had traveled through this same cold. She had not been defeated by it. She had come deliberately, knowing the danger, and had come anyway. Margaret stayed for 3 full days. She sat by the hearth and told many stories of the fort, of the river in summer, of the time she had delivered twins in a snowstorm not far from where they now sat. She had been younger then, she said, and more foolish. But the babies had come into the world in the middle of a blizzard, and she had kept them warm with her own hands and the heated furs until help could arrive. She helped Halldóra tend the fire. She showed Sigríður how to bank the fire in the evening, to push coals to the sides and cover them with ash, so that the fire would burn slowly and steadily through the night. She sang to Auður and Helga, Scottish songs and Métis songs, songs that had their own kind of cold in them, their own understanding of endurance. On the 15th of January, the temperature fell again to 44 below. But Margaret did not leave. She stayed. She and Halldóra sat together by the fire and spoke of their lives. Margaret had lost 3 husbands, one to fever, one to an accident with a horse, one to a simple stopping of the heart. She had raised her own young ones alone and had become a midwife because she understood what women needed when the land was trying to take them. On the morning of the 17th of January, when the cold had finally begun to ease, the thermometer showing only 30 below, Margaret prepared to leave. "Your walls are sound," she said to Halldóra. "I have seen houses fail in such cold. I have stood in rooms where people's breath froze on the walls. I have seen walls crack because the houses could not hold the warmth. This house will hold. The people here will hear of it, and they will understand that you have done something that matters." The cold began to break on the 18th of January. The wind shifted slightly to the west. By noon, the temperature had risen to 11 below. The wind came back to life, but it was a warmer wind now, a wind that had begun its journey in a place slightly less far north. The snow began to soften at its surface, becoming heavy and dense. By evening, the temperature had climbed to 5 below, and Halldóra, cautiously, opened the window wider. Fresh air came into the house that did not bring the shock of Arctic cold with it. The transition was immediate. The air inside the house had been static for 9 days. Now it moved. The daughters could feel it, could feel that something had changed. On the morning of the 19th of January, a buggy came up the river road from Bismarck. The wheels broke through the crust of snow, and the buggy moved slowly, cautiously, but it moved. The man in the buggy was Clement A. Lounsbury, editor of the Bismarck Daily Tribune. Lounsbury was 45 years old, a newspaperman who had come to Dakota Territory looking for truth and had found instead the usual mixture of fact and opinion and convenience. He had heard about the widow's house. He had done the mathematics, the temperature readings that had been coming out of Painted Woods Bend through the telegraph operators, the reports from the camps. He had become curious. He was carrying a thermometer, a notebook, and a pencil, and an open mind. He knocked on the door, and she let him in. He looked around without comment and began his work. Lounsbury spent 3 hours inside the house. He took the interior temperature reading at the center of the room, 50 degrees. He took a reading against the Griatladi stone face, 41 degrees. He measured the walls with a tape rule, noting the thickness of each layer. He examined the Klumbrunhaus, running his hand along the herringbone pattern. He examined the Ruhmfelder, the felted sheepskins, touching them and asking questions about how they had been made and why. He looked at the berm from inside and outside, walking around the house and pacing out its dimensions. He sat by the hearth and listened to Halldóra explain, in her plain prairie English with its Iceland syntax flips, subject and verb in an order that sounded foreign, how each layer worked, how each material had been chosen, how the ancients of Iceland had built to withstand cold for 1,000 years. In Iceland, she said, the walls are 3 generations old. Some are older. The people know what works. This is not new. This is old knowledge, old practice. The herringbone pattern, it distributes the weight. The stone face inside, it holds the heat. The sheepskin, it stops the cold from moving through. The berm outside, it stops the wind from pushing the cold into the walls. Lounsbury, making notes, nodded. The woman is right, he said, when he had finished. The science is sound. The herringbone course distributes the load evenly. The sheepskin pelt creates a vapor barrier. The berm prevents wind-driven convection. The stone holds the heat through thermal mass. This is not superstition. This is engineering. This is applied physics and architecture, and it works. On the 22nd of January, the Bismarck Daily Tribune printed a front-page article. The headline read, "The Widow Thorson's Sod and Sheep Pile Castle." Lounsbury had reproduced the hand-drawn cross-section of the walls. He had named every layer in both English and Icelandic. He had reproduced a photograph of Halldóra standing beside her berm, her hand upon the sod, her daughters visible through the south window behind her. The article had begun with this paragraph. In the recent cold wave that brought temperatures to 50 degrees below zero at Painted Woods Bend, the house of Halldóra Pálsson, widow and Icelandic settler, maintained an interior temperature of 48 to 52 degrees, heated by a single 9-inch hearth. Meanwhile, the display houses of a certain Bismarck speculator cracked and split. It is time this territory learned that foreign knowledge, ancient wisdom, and sound engineering matter more than town lot schemes and railroad schemes. The article was reprinted in the St. Paul Pioneer Press on the 25th of January. It appeared in the Chicago Tribune on the 30th of January. Harper's Weekly published an engraving of the wall cross-section in the issue of February 5th. On the 12th of February, the tax forfeiture filing he had submitted was scheduled to be heard before Judge Alfred Wycliffe Edgerton of the Burleigh County District Court. Pastor Hjalmarsson testified that the house was a permanent improvement of sound construction. Magnus Sveinsson testified to the quality of the materials. Tom Bear Comes Out testified, in English, that the house would stand longer than the wooden houses of the town. Halldóra herself testified. She spoke in plain English, with one phrase in her native Icelandic that she did not translate. Þetta ekki bluffhus. This is not bluff. This is stone and turf, and the knowledge of people who have built against the cold for 10 centuries. Judge Edgerton dismissed the tax forfeiture filing on the 14th of February with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. He wrote in his decision that the defendant had demonstrated beyond question that her dwelling was a permanent improvement, that it was sound in construction and engineering, and that the laws of the territory explicitly protected such claims. The Bismarck Boomer published its last issue in May of 1887. Its owner, Mortimer Pinckney Beecham, had withdrawn his financial backing when his bank failed after a run of depositors who had learned of his speculative schemes. Beecham himself left Bismarck in disgrace. He went to St. Paul and tried to rebuild his fortune. He drank more than he worked. By 1894, he died in a charity ward, and no one from Bismarck attended his funeral. On the 3rd of March, 1887, Halldóra walked to the Burleigh County Recorder's office in Bismarck. She had brought her wall section drawing, rendered in clean copperplate, with every measurement noted, every material named, every principle of construction explained. She signed her name, Halldóra Þórarinsdóttir Pálsson, and filed the drawing as a matter of record so that any future person might learn from it. In April of 1889, Professor James Wilson of the Iowa Agricultural College wrote to Halldóra asking permission to include her wall section drawing in the college's Bulletin Number 14, a publication on prairie cold climate construction. Halldóra granted permission with a single sentence: "Let the knowledge serve where it is needed." The drawing appeared in the Bulletin in September of 1889. It was referenced in textbooks. It was cited in papers. Young architects studied it. Young farmers studied it. Sigríður, Halldóra's eldest daughter, graduated from the Dakota Territorial Normal School in 1893. She became a teacher. She taught for 41 years, and for the last 12 years of her teaching career, she was the principal of Bismarck Public School No. 2. She never married. She lived in a house of her own building, and she kept the Thorson name. Helga, the second daughter, married Olafur, the son of Magnus Sveinsson, in the year 1898. She took over the Cheviot flock and became known throughout the territory for the quality of her felted wool. She lived in a house built in the same style as her mother's house, sod and stone, with felted sheepskin in the walls. She lived 96 years. Auður, the youngest daughter, studied architecture at the Iowa State Agricultural College from 1893 to 1897. She moved to St. Paul and worked with architects and builders on prairie vernacular, cold climate housing through the 1920s. In 1924, she published a paper titled Composite Insulating Walls for North Plains Vernacular Construction. In that paper, she cited her mother's wall section drawing. She improved on it, testing new materials. But the fundamental principle remained: layers of different materials, each with its own purpose, trapping still air, holding heat against the cold that comes from the north. Halldóra herself remained at Painted Woods Bend. She lived in her torfbær for 41 years after John's loss. She saw the winters of 1888, 1893, 1899, 1908. She saw the house stand sound through all of them. She saw her daughters grow to women and have families of their own. She saw the railroad come to Bismarck and make the town into a city. She saw the territory become a state. She saw the 19th century become the 20th century. On the 7th of October in the year 1928, Halldóra Pálsson was buried in the cemetery at Vítarsíða, Painted Woods Lutheran Church. She was 77 years old. Beside her grave was the marker of her husband John, who had been lost to the Hart River blizzard 43 years before. In 1987, exactly 100 years after the Great Cold Wave, a great-granddaughter named Margrét Pálsson Ólafsson, with the help of state historians and preservation societies, restored the torfbær of Painted Woods Bend. The walls were still standing. The stone face was still sound. The sod still held its shape. The wall section drawing that Halldóra had filed in the county recorder's office in 1887 was found, and it was donated to the State Historical Society. In 1993, it was included in a national exhibition of historic American building techniques. It remains there still. Praise to the strong ones. Praise to the women who build against the cold. Praise to the hands that shape stone and bind turf and felt the wool of sheep into walls that stand for 100 years. May we remember their names. May we honor their skill. May the cold find no path through the walls that such women have built.